Welcome back. I'm the Rusty Autoholic guy where you see every single nut and bolt that I work on. So this morning I went out and got my new tires installed. I'm really happy with them. They actually ride really well. But when they had taken the tires off, I got a chance to look at the brakes. And the front brakes might pass inspection, but the rear brakes absolutely will not pass inspection. So today we are going to be installing new brake pads on the front and rear. When I change brakes, I just like to change both at the same time. It's a personal preference. You don't have to do it. The other thing I am doing is something that I like to call pad slapping. I'm not replacing the rotors. I'm literally just going to put new pads on it and go. The rotors look pretty good. They're a little bit rusted, but it had sat for a while, so I think it will be fine. But the other thing I noticed was it was raining a little bit this morning. Went to use the windshield wipers, and they were junk. So we're also going to put new windshield wiper blades on it. So hopefully once the brakes and the windshield wipers are installed, this will pass inspection and we can actually take it wheeling. So time lapse.
First I removed the old windshield wipers and installed the two new ones. Before jacking up the rear end, I broke loose all the lug nuts on the rear axle. With the lug nuts loose, I lifted the rear axle, used the impact to remove the rear wheel, and now I have access to the caliper. With the wheel and tire off, I used a socket wrench to remove the caliper off the rear axle. Using a small pry bar, I removed the old brake pads from the caliper. Now I'm using a disc brake spreader tool to push the piston back into the caliper. With the piston pushed back into the caliper, I installed the new brake pads and installed the caliper back onto the rotor, putting back the two screws and tightening them with the socket wrench. With the brakes reassembled, I reinstalled the wheel back onto the axle. Switching to the other side, I used the impact to remove the lug nuts and I removed the rear wheel. Using a socket wrench and small pry bar, I unbolt the rear caliper and remove the old brake pads. Now I'm using a disc brake spreader tool to push the piston back into the caliper. With the piston pushed back into the caliper, I installed the new brake pads and installed the caliper back onto the rotor, putting back the two screws and tightening them with the socket wrench. With the rear brakes now done, I reinstalled the rear wheel, start installing the lug nuts by hand, use a impact to tighten them real quick, lower the Jeep, and then I go around with my big socket wrench to tighten all the lug nuts. Moving to the front, I loosen all the lug nuts with my big socket wrench. Then using a jack, I lift the front driver's side wheel, use the impact to remove the lug nuts, and I remove the wheel. Using the socket wrench and a small pry bar, I remove the front caliper off the axle. After the brakes are removed, I use the disc brake spreader tool to push the piston back into the caliper. And with that done, I installed the new brakes onto the caliper and reinstalled the caliper onto the front axle. With the front caliper reinstalled on the axle, I reinstalled the wheel and tire, put on the lug nuts by hand, tightened them with the impact, and then I lower the Jeep back down onto the ground. Moving the jack to the passenger side, I lift the Jeep, remove the wheel and tire with the impact, and now I have access to the brakes. Removing the front caliper, I then use the disc brake spreader tool to push in the piston before reinstalling the new brake pads onto the front caliper. Then I went to reinstall the caliper, but seeing as everything had gone really well, I had troubles getting the lower bolt to line up correctly on the front axle. But as Ronnie would say, once I held my mouth right, I was able to get the caliper installed correctly. With everything lined up, I tightened both bolts with my socket wrench, reinstalled the wheel, put the lug nuts on by hand, tightened them with the impact, lowered the Jeep, and then tightened everything with the big socket wrench.
So, got the brakes on, got the wipers on. I have to admit, I've done a lot of brakes in my life, and I absolutely love the way they designed the Wrangler brakes. I did all 4 brakes and the wipers in less than an hour. That's just a really, really good design. And assuming you do have the right tools, you really need that brake caliper tool, which just saves you a ton of time. Other than that, it's a 19mm for the wheels, a 13mm to pull the calipers off, and a pry bar just to get the old pads off. Like I said, the front pads actually looked really good, but it's a personal preference of mine. When I replace brakes, I replace both the front and back. So clearly didn't need to do it on the front, but it just makes me feel better. So anyway, leave a comment down below. Give this video a thumbs up if you liked it. If you didn't, you know what to do. And hey, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, consider subscribing. And if you have, as always, thank you, and I'll see you in the next video very soon. Goodbye.